Pistol Pete's Basketball Diaries are brought to you by the official Pistol Pete website, Pistol Pete 23. Go to Pistol Pete 23 and learn more about the legend.
Want to learn more about Pistol Pete? Read Pistol, The Life of Pete Maravich by best-selling author Mark Kriegel, a book critics are calling mesmerizing, transcendent, and sensational. Pistol, The Life of Pete Maravich, wherever books are sold.
I tell you, there's such a thing as the law of averages. Pistol will have to cool off pretty soon because he has not missed too many shots this season.
I think he defies that law and a few others sometimes. Maravich. Boy, he's got all kinds of moves. What move does this guy have? Up front to Jimmy McMillan. He drives. Off the glass, no good. Coleman rebounds. Almost fine defense by Maravich. Another steal.
I don't know how you stop him. He is too much.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I'm running out of things to say about Maravich. It's good.
Mark, they're in basketball country. They reached the top. This is supposed to be the best of times for this family.
Well, in basketball terms, it certainly looks like it. 1965, Press takes over for Everett Case as the head coach of North Carolina State. He takes a severely undermanned team and wins the ACC championship. It's one of the greatest coaching jobs in the history of ACC basketball.
Coach of the year.
He's a near unanimous selection as ACC coach of the year.
NCAA tournament team.
Well, they beat Duke.
Yeah.
For the ACC championship. But, you know, Press's team has two guys who can dunk. Duke is loaded with future pros. It's a wonderful coaching job, and he does it by preaching ensemble basketball, team defense.
All the things he doesn't instill in Pete.
At the same time, Pete is really coming into his own now. Pete is drawing notices in a way that he couldn't have in South Carolina. There's right before Christmas, Press's players gather for a pickup game, serious pickup games, okay? ACC players. And Pete joins in. And they take turns trying to beat on him. 2 hours, 3 hours. He can't miss. He can't miss. At the end of the game, two guys who played for Press go off to the side. They look at each other. And they say, this is in Reynolds Coliseum where NC State plays, by the way. They say, are you thinking what I'm thinking? Yeah. Kid's going to be the greatest that ever was. They both have the story. They both refer to this as the greatest game at Reynolds that no one has ever seen.
He had some shot that he created for that game.
The going down shot. And it would come back again. They try to like pound on him for hours. Yeah. There's nothing they can do. And they're physically, they're bigger, they're stronger, but there's nothing they can do with him. And at the end of the game, he goes going down, and he tosses like a 35, 40-foot hook shot. Goes in, he goes right down, is a couple steps down to the locker room at Reynolds. He just goes right on in. And, they're just left to be in awe.
But as good as this is getting, the family's unraveling.
Yes. Helen's starting to drink. The pressure is getting to everybody. They're caring. Press and Helen are now raising Ronnie's daughter. Ronnie's marriage falls apart. Ronnie goes off to Vietnam. And Press and Helen are left to care for the daughter of that marriage, Diana. And they raise her as their own. And in many ways, to me, this is the most ennobling thing about Press. He is a really, really solid father and mother to this girl. Because what he's doing is he's really serving as the primary parent because Helen's starting to drink now.
Helen's drinking as a result of Press being away.
Well, Press
recruiting, coaching.
Press is recruiting, Press is coaching, Press is training Pete. Pete would go from one practice to another. He would go from the high school gym to the North Carolina State gym. His whole life was practice. And when he diverged from that path, there was a price to pay. One day, he shows up for a North Carolina State practice, and he would attend most of the North Carolina State practices with a black eye. One of Press's players said, "What happened to you?" And Press smelled beer on his breath. Press didn't want anything interfering with his plan, which was for Pete to play for State and for them to go down as the greatest father-son team in the history of the game.
And for him to make all that money.
And to make all the money, for him to set all the scoring records.
What kind of success was Pete having playing ball in high school?
It's very clear that Pete is one of the most sought-after recruits in the country. The thing is, everybody knows he's going to go play for his father.
Let's talk about that and more when we return. We'll be right back. Mark, the grand plan doesn't work out.
Well, it doesn't work out because Pete can't get into North Carolina State. You know, there were really no exceptions to the SAT requirement at the time. Pete kept falling a few points short. So the choice came down to West Virginia or an obscure school in the SEC, Louisiana State University.
How did LSU come about?
Well, the enterprising athletic director at LSU heard about a coach with a kid who was the greatest high school player in America. He said, that would be a good thing. So it was a package deal. From the beginning, it was a package deal. Press got a contract for $15,000 a year, which was $5,000 more than he was making at NC State. It was, on Press's terms, unheard of money. He thought it would give him financial freedom. But Pete didn't want to go. Pete wanted to go to West Virginia, be the next Jerry West.
Even after he couldn't get into NC State, that's where he wanted to go.
He really, I think he understood it was the healthy thing for him to get away. And the coach there was Bucky Waters. He liked the offense. He liked the idea of becoming the next Jerry West.
Right.
West Virginia was a basketball school.
Yes, it was.
And LSU was, in basketball terms, lower than Clemson. Mm-hmm. They played in a place called the Cow Palace, which was really for a livestock show.
The conference was lower than the ACC.
Well, there was Kentucky, there was everyone else, which is, there was Kentucky, and a little bit Tennessee, and everyone else. But it was not a basketball conference. It was a football school in a football conference.
And so Press took the job. How did he convince his son to go?
He said, if you don't go, don't ever come home. And Pete knew he was serious. Pete turns around and says, okay, well, if I'm going there, you get me a car. So Pete springs for a Volkswagen, which I guess is not a recruiting violation if you're giving it to your son.
Did they literally?
But interestingly enough, okay, Press, who always recruited Desire, this is the first blue chip talent he ever recruited. It's his own kid.
Right. He didn't get
and his last. There was nothing that was going to come between Press and his vision, which was coaching his son in college. But I'll tell you what, when the Maraviches got to Baton Rouge, everyone forgot it was a football school. Press comes out, his first press conference, typical Press, where do you see my boy?
I remember about the first time we played Pete, when he came into town. Of course, we were all skeptical about how really good a player could be. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I can still see the headlines the next day after Pete had scored 55 or so to beat us. It said, Tulane is believers. And right. we became believers after that.
That's
so
exactly
from that
right.
point on, we were all believers that Pete was the real thing.
Exactly.
He came in with his knees bothering him. He looked a little hobbled. Again, he sold out the place, and it was packed, people sitting on the floors. And he went through us with 66 points, and it became Tulane versus Pete, basically,
exactly.
is what it was. And we had to try to hold him down as much as we could, what little we did. And that was the game where we all rotated. We took turns, and you just couldn't guard him the whole game.
You could not.
Because physically, the amount of effort that Pete exerted, defensively, you couldn't keep up with.
You could not.
Because he was in control of the ball so well.
Right. And
that was a tough game to play, and we had a good time with that.
Exactly.
Mark, so the two of them enter LSU. One is the head coach of the varsity, one is a freshman.
Thing is, freshmen were not eligible to play varsity ball at that time. So what happened is the freshman games became a happening. People would line up around the Ag Center, around the Cow Palace for hours waiting to get into the freshman games. And Pete would come out, he started scoring 50, 66 points one game. It's a sensation, you know. His hair is growing out a little bit at the time. Varsity game starts, people file out. You know, guys who played on the varsity team, remember, they walk in to the Ag Center, place is packed, they come out to shoot layups, everyone's leaving. But the whole focus was on Pete. And within that, the focus was on Pete's scoring. It was a way for everyone to keep count, for everyone to keep interested. And, you know, he averages over 43 points as a freshman. And it becomes clear that Press, remember, a guy who was a great teacher of team basketball, a great teacher of basketball defense, becomes consumed with his son's scoring average. It's almost as if by setting the record, he can save the family, which is veering into more and more trouble.
But these contradictions go back endless years. They go right back to
They're
the
pretty
beginning.
consistent in everything.
John Wooden. They go back right to beyond John Wooden, back earlier on in Pennsylvania. So he was consistent about his contradictions.
The rules did not apply to Pete. You know, and it was true for off the court behavior as well. You know, if you went out and had too good a time, the way you could cover yourself was to be out with Pete. At one point, Press wants to suspend or expel certain guys on the team. And one of the assistants brings it to his attention, I don't think you can do that. Why not? Well, everyone was out with Pete. Okay, case closed. Next. He couldn't really discipline Pete because that would deaden his own ambition. And at that time, Press was trying to run a Division I program, which was, except for his own son, completely lacking in talent. He's raising a daughter almost all by himself at this time. Helen's getting worse and worse. He has a stepson off in Vietnam. You know, what does he have? What does he have to show that he was here? What does he have to show that he was a great basketball man? He has his son, setting a scoring record that will stand forever and ever. There's also what we see now, a theme that will recur again and again, is there is an economic imperative for Pete to play the way he plays. The governor starts coming to the games. And the governor signs into law a plan that had been on the drawing boards for a long time for a new arena, the Assembly Center. You know, they've been playing in the Cow Palace. All of a sudden, Pete comes. They're going to play in the Assembly Center. They're going to build a whole new arena. Kids start playing basketball. Remember, this is football country. All of a sudden, fathers start like putting up basketball hoops in the driveway. You know, everybody wants to be like Pete. People are starting to steal his socks. You know, the famous floppy socks. They become souvenir items. Kids are imitating first all over the South and then all over the country.
When we come back, we'll look at Pistol Pete's sophomore year at LSU. We'll be right back. Well, it's come to pass. Press is going to coach his boy.
And he turns a 3-23 team into a 14-12 team. Pretty big turnaround. And Pete averages 44 points a game. Thing is that Press figures for LSU to have a chance to win, Pete's got to shoot 40 times a game, which violates every principle of team basketball and all the precepts that made Press a great coach in the first place.
Except the contradiction is consistent.
Yes.
And what about his recruiting? Did he have any players to play with?
Oh, yeah. He recruits guys. The number one requirement is, can you play with my kid? So what he winds up recruiting, and some of it is by default because, you know, great players are not going to go to LSU.
So they're not going to get the ball.
Well,
they're not going to be part of the offense.
They don't want to play in a cow palace. That's the first thing. You know, it's not basketball country. But he pairs Pete with a team with two basically 6-foot guards, very good ball handlers, good players, but they're 6-foot guards, and they know how to play with Pete. One of the guys, Jeff Tribbett, had played with a phenomenal scorer, Rick Mount, in high school, so he knew how to give it up. The other guy, Rich Hickman, is from Aliquippa, Press and Pete's hometown. So it's kind of all in the family there. What happens is, you know, they do rise substantially in the standings. As I said, from 3-23 to 14-12, which LSU had not been above 500 in quite some time. But more than that, they create a level of excitement really never seen before in the SEC. You know, they're drawing 15,000 people in Tuscaloosa at Alabama. They create a level of excitement never before seen in the SEC. You know, they're drawing huge numbers of fans in places most people haven't even heard of basketball. Athens, Georgia, Tuscaloosa. All of a sudden, these places are really excited about basketball.
Do they get better basketball players coming to their school?
Before, the SEC was basically Kentucky as far as, you know, national powers. But now the SEC is drawing notice from around the country. One of the things you need to bear in mind, particularly about SEC basketball, is that it was still segregated. And when Press comes in, he makes it clear that he's going to recruit black players. And he tries particularly hard with Harold Sylvester, who's a high school star in New Orleans. And as Bud Johnson recalls, you know, a reporter calls the LSU president and says, is it true that Press is recruiting black players? And he says, oh no, I think my coach was misquoted. And that was the end of that. So there's always, you know, there's always a question as to whether or not Pete is really competing on a level playing field. He's not. He's not. The playing field is, in fact, skewed in his favor because he is playing in a segregated league. What Press does is he schedules teams outside the SEC. They play Duquesne. They play Oregon State. Eventually, they'll play St. John's. They'll play in a variety of holiday tournaments. They'll play, you know, all over the country. And Pete will be seen. And there will be a demand for Pete to be seen.
And that's how he's getting the national exposure.
Yes.
Which takes it to a whole different level.
By the end of Pete's sophomore year, he's far and away the top scorer in the country. Press is consumed with his scoring average. But he's also used the scoring average and Pete to sell the program and to sell the SEC. And Sports Illustrated on March 4th, 1968, comes out with a cover story on Pete and Press. It's written by Curry Kirkpatrick. And that really crystallizes the notion of pistol for the country. That's what people will remember for a good long time when they think of pistol. That codifies the image. The socks, the hair, the co-eds love him. So against the backdrop of the late 60s, the crew-cut dad and his beetle-haired son became national figures. And there was a name for what they did. It was called Showtime.
If you remember this, in warm-ups, Pete would put on a show in warm-ups. And, of course, when you played, you never looked at your opponent.
Right.
But, of course, we were all doing this as we were, you know, watching Pete do his thing. But I can see those black shoes, those low-cut shoes that he wore, and he was standing out on the foul line, and he'd be doing this and going between his legs and over his shoulders, and the guys would be just shooting normal. We'd be shooting our normal layups.
Exactly right.
Mark, tell me about Showtime.
Well, as we know by now, Pete was a prodigious practicer. You know, so people would look for moves they saw in practice in the game. But sometimes there would be a move that no one had ever seen before. A guy like Bud Johnson would go, Pete, where'd you get that? I never saw that one before. He goes, I practiced it a lot of times. When? He goes, in my head. And there were moments, there were just explosions of creativity on the basketball court that no one had anticipated before. After his first game with Tulane, he did a pass between his legs that after the game, the Tulane players demanded to see again and again and again on replay in their film session because they still couldn't believe they had actually seen it. Pete's game became the subject of great debate among SEC officials because no one knew how to call a game with Pete. You didn't want an inexperienced ref because the guy would sit there and swallow the whistle in awe.
Pistol Pete's Basketball Diaries are brought to you by the official Pistol Pete website, Pistol Pete 23. Go to Pistol Pete 23 and learn more about the legend.
Want to learn more about Pistol Pete? Read Pistol, The Life of Pete Maravich by best-selling author Mark Kriegel, a book critics are calling mesmerizing, transcendent, and sensational. Pistol, The Life of Pete Maravich, wherever books are sold.
No one knew how to call a game with Pete. You didn't want an inexperienced ref because the guy would sit there and swallow the whistle in awe. Sophomore year, Pete had a move. He waves his hand over the ball and passes the other way. Ref calls him for a travel. Pete stops and says, "How could you say I was walking? You've never seen that move before."
I tell you, there's such a thing as a law of averages. Pistol will have to cool off pretty soon because he has not missed too many shots this season.
I think he defies that law and a few others sometimes. Maravich. Boy, he's got all kinds of moves. What move does this guy have, Gil? Up front to Jimmy McMillan. He drives. Off the glass, no good. Coleman rebounds. Coleman fine defense by Maravich. Another steal.
I don't know how you stop him. He is too much.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I'm running out of things to say about Maravich. It's good.
Mark, Showtime is a harbinger of things to come in basketball.
Yes, it is. And it's a manifestation of Press's vision, again. But looking at it from today's perspective, I'm not sure people really understand what a departure it was back then. The ideal for a college athlete was still Bill Bradley, a guy who made an art of blending in. Bill Bradley was loath to call attention to himself. But everything about Pete's game was flagrant, was funky. It demanded to be seen. There was nothing subtle about Pete's game.
It was center stage.
It was center stage. But Bradley, the Rhodes Scholar, the model student athlete from Princeton, was really a very, very practiced, accomplished player. But that's the guy your father wanted you to be. But the guy you wanted to be at that time, if you were a kid at that time, was Pete. It was still a game controlled very much by a basketball establishment. There was no dunking. Remember, the dunk was outlawed. It was not a game that placed a premium on expression or self-expression. I spoke to Wooden about this, and he said, hey, if one of my players passed between his legs or behind his back, he knew where he'd be, right on the bench with me. And that was the antithesis of what Press was putting into practice with his own son. It's once again, you have, Wooden and Press, they each respect each other immensely. And this is at the time when Wooden is using Press's offense, the high-low. Pete is really a sign of things to come. And the whole emphasis on self-expression and Showtime is really where the game is going. Well, that's a problem. That's a big, big problem because basketball is still a team sport.
That's correct.
Also, the guy averaged 44 points a game. I don't think that record will ever, ever, ever be broken. First of all, I don't think anyone's staying in school that long.
That's correct.
But beyond that, to shoot that much is an almost impossible task. Pete was given a kind of crazy mission to score that many points. But I don't think that people really understand what type of endurance it takes to shoot that much. Now, Pete took a little time off on the defensive end of the court, but it was almost imperative. He had to do it. There's no way he could keep that up.
Did he ever get taken out of the game?
Not often. He was a tough kid on the court. Going back to freshman year, he takes a big gash, takes 12 stitches over an eye, comes back to the game, hits a winning shot. He wasn't a big kid, He was a pretty tough kid.
What were the fans expecting to see? They were expecting to see Showtime.
Well, think about the pressure of expectation here.
Yes.
If the kid scores 43 points, he's had a bad game. Tennessee had played.
Yeah, he had
really
bad games against Tennessee.
But Tennessee played him well. But it was a boxing 1, a boxing 2, a boxing 3, and then when he's not looking, beat him down. Harold Sylvester, who played for Tulane, said, we beat on him a lot, and it still didn't keep him down.
Yeah, and you couldn't play him left, you couldn't play him right, you just couldn't keep him down.
Well, the famous story is Tom Nasalki, who later winds up as his coach in the Jazz, is then the coach at Tulane. And he says, make him go left, make him go left, make him go left. He went left for about 55.
That's right. He held him down at 55.
People forget that these scoring feats of his were absolutely Ruthian. The second half of a game against St. John's in Hawaii, holiday tournament, St. John's scores 39 points. Pete scores 40. Lou Carnesecca, who is one of the great saints of New York basketball, calls it the greatest 15 minutes he's ever seen on a court. You know what he said? Scores 69 against Alabama.
Carnesecca said, I believe, that he did a very poor job of coaching in the second half because he was watching Pete play.
Just like Press, he became a fan. And that's what Pete did to even the most, grizzled coaches. He turned them into fans. Now, when Carnesecca goes back to New York, he starts singing Pete's praises. He's comparing him favorably to Oscar Robertson and Jerry West. Carnesecca's coming back saying, this kid's better. This kid's worth all the money you could pay him.
Mark, many of those games, he changes his shot. He would go to the foul line.
I think sometimes Pete got bored. Mm-hmm. But you can see his foul shot change from sophomore to senior year. But he's always experimenting.
Yeah, it looked like an experimentation.
Pete, Pete's still shooting set shots. Some of those, we haven't touched on this. He scores 44 points a game without a three-point shot, mind you. And some of those shots he's taking, and you could see it in the videos. He takes these set shots from distances that really should be like 4-pointers. Mm-hmm. But there's such a wide variety of shots he's practiced. I don't think he thinks anything of putting them into practice in a game, of doing them in a game.
I know that when I was with him, he even tried underhand free throws.
Right.
As an experimentation.
Try behind the back free throws.
I'm surprised he didn't either. And in his junior year, the team was marginally successful.
They're a 500 team.
Press started to put him on the road. But Pete continued to score.
Showing off your star came at a great price. The team started off well, but there was a certain amount of dissension, and you can't sustain a winning basketball team on just one guy. Pete's senior year, they do have a much more talented supporting cast. They have two accomplished, talented big men in Apple Sanders and Danny Hester. And they finished the regular season at 20-8. Now, they go to the NIT, which is really still a big deal. The NCAA tournament was still a 32-team tournament, and you had to, there were no at-large bids. So going to the NIT was really still a big deal. Plus, they were going to what Press considered the basketball capital of the world. They were going to New York City. They were going to Madison Square Garden. And, Press doesn't, unlike most fathers and certainly most coaches, Press doesn't tamp down the expectations. He incites them. He had been quoted before saying, there's more pressure on my kid than anyone in America. And before they head into New York, they say, he's asked by columnists at the New York Post, what about your kid? What do you think? He goes, I think he's the best damn basketball player I've ever seen. You tell me what or what coach is going to say that about his son or his star player?
He created them. Mark, Press and Pete are the most hallowed grounds for basketball. New York City.
The NIT was supposed to be the ultimate demonstration of Press's brilliance as a coach. You know, the gift he was going to give to the basketball world, Pete. Instead, what you begin to see is Pete getting crushed under the weight of expectations. The media coverage is intense in a way that, you know, he's never seen in Baton Rouge. It begins with Lou Carnesecca, you know, saying he's better than Oscar Robertson and Jerry West. There's all sorts of talk about his contract, his, you know, pro contract that he's about to sign. You know, will he make $2 million? These are unheard of numbers. You know, it's clear that basketball is part of the television business now. That, you know, the television needs Pistol Pete. They need a great white hope.
Well, they showed that in the collegiate game when he played Kentucky on national television.
Well, the Kentucky game is televised on 206 stations, more than saw the previous year's showdown between Kareem and Elvin Hayes. You know, so it was clear that Pete was a hot television property. And the NBA, going into the 70s, was going to be, hopefully, driven by television. It's a television business. That's what that's what the example of football had taught everybody.
So now he's in New York under the glare of the hottest lights he's ever been under. He's got the scoring record, too, that they're talking about.
He set the scoring record.
So now he begins to crack.
He begins to crack. His knee is worn down. He gets a hip pointer. But more than that, it's this bearing down of expectations, the matchmaking, you know. They beat Georgetown in the first game. Pete has a lackluster game. They beat Oklahoma, and then they're paired against Marquette, which the only reason they were in the NIT in the first place is that Al McGuire got upset, and he pulled his team out of the NCAA. That's how big the NIT was at the time. He didn't like their seeding. He didn't like where they put them. Marquette had Dean Memminger, had some real, you know, from Harlem, had some really good players, really good defensive players, and basically they shut Pete down. They shut Pete down. Of course, it didn't help that Pete had been getting drunk as hell all week and went into that game with a terrible hangover. And it was really, looking back to my mind, a very willful act of self-destruction. It was Pete's way of begging out. And when it's over, he's sitting in the Knicks training room in Madison Square Garden in a hot tub with the team trainer, with the LSU trainer, Billy Simmons. And he sees Walt Clyde Frazier in the locker room. Frazier comes up to him. Billy Simmons remembers this. He says, I got something for you when you come up to the pros. Mm-hmm. Pete's sitting in the tub. He goes, yeah, what's that? He goes, defense. You know? Clyde
Not that
exits.
68-point game.
Clyde exits. Bradley, who's playing for the Knicks, comes over now. He goes, they want you, man. They're ready for you. And it's a very interesting exchange. It's very clear in Simmons' mind. It's really like one great white hope talking to another. And it's a title that neither man, you know, bargained for. But it came with its own, again, oppressive set of expectations. And it followed Pete throughout the rest of his career.
What was Press's response in New York to Pete's performance? How did he respond to that performance?
Press was crestfallen. You know, he thought that New York never got to see the real Pete, that the basketball gods never really got to see the real Pete. And he was so eager. This was in Press's mind, this was still Claire B's home. But I think Press was crestfallen. In the last game, which is against Army, coached by Bobby Knight, Pete sits out injured. And he asks a teammate, he goes, listen, when they go out, when we go out to be introduced, can you walk out with me? And the guy, Russ, says, why do you want me to walk out with you? He says, well, these people from New York, they paid a lot of money to see me play, and they're really going to boo the hell out of me. And they did.
Mm-hmm. He was awkward in these circumstances.
He was socially awkward. As graceful and as magical as he could be on the court in the flash of a moment, he could be awkward socially. He'd turn his eyes away, and he had already begun to use alcohol to break the ice, to relieve the pressure, to escape. I don't know if you'd characterize him as an alcoholic or what, but he was already binge drinking.
So he leaves New York, not performing to expectations.
Well, while he's in the NIT, they're already negotiating his pro contract. Mm-hmm. And basically what it comes down to, the Atlanta Hawks or the Carolina Cougars of the ABA. I think that they were both offering what at the time could be considered outrageously lucrative deals. And Carolina was dangling, the possibility of a movie contract and hamburger franchises. But I think that ultimately...
And back to North Carolina.
But ultimately, Press wanted Pete to go to the established league, not the ABA. He wanted Pete to go to the NBA. He wanted Pete to go play in the league of Jerry West, of Oscar Roberts.
Even though the ABA was probably suited more for his game.
Yes.
At that time.
Yeah. He wanted Pete to play in the established league. He saw, I think that, he didn't want his revolutionary player going to the Revolutionary League. He wanted his revolutionary player going to the established league. He wanted his revolutionary player revolutionizing the established league.
And this was another demonstration of the influence of Press over Pete, where Pete...
Basically, I think that's what it comes down to.
And where Pete might have said, I would have liked to play in the ABA.
Pete was still an extension of Press. He had his moments of rebellion, and they had their moments of conflict, certainly. But he was still Press's creation, and he thought of himself like that too.
The decision is made for him to go to Atlanta for the largest contract to be paid to a player at that point in the NBA.
Advertised as $1.9 or $2 million. In fact, it's 1.5 with a condo, with a country club membership, with a car, with $50 a month for gas, which was actually a lot of money back then, and a phone in the car, which my favorite
had to be
my favorite piece of the contract. It was, the greatest contract in sports at that time for a brief moment, but it also sets Pete apart as a target. What you start to see now is this is another telling of the Elvis myth in a certain way. He's the great white hope. And, it's almost, he's almost more analogous to a pop music sensation. Someone like him comes along once every generation, whether it's Elvis or Chet Baker or Eminem. He is seen as the white guy performing in a predominantly black form. And he's being sold as that. And that comes with enormous pressures in itself. And it engenders enormous resentment. I don't think that there was a worse place for him to go than to the Atlanta Hawks in 1970. Everyone went against type. You had a basketball team struggling to survive in the Deep South, in football country, okay? They were playing in Georgia Tech's Fieldhouse, which held about 7,900, okay? They were a very good team. The only thing wrong with the Atlanta Hawks is that they couldn't get by the Lakers of Jerry West and Will Chamberlain and Elgin Baylor. Other than that, they were a great team. But Pete needed a running team. The Hawks were a predominantly black team. I think 7 of their first 8 players were black. They were also a slow-down team. They liked to slow the ball down, set up the offense. That made life difficult for Pete. The money Pete was making made life difficult for Pete. I mean, you know, there was an extraordinary guard, Joe Caldwell, one of the best defenders in the league, an extraordinary player, you know, one of the most complete guards in the game at that time. He was making peanuts, and all of a sudden, here comes Pete. Why is Pete making that much money? Because he's white? Because he's good on television? Because people want to see him? Try explaining that to Joe Caldwell.
You couldn't.
You couldn't. You couldn't. And the coach, Richie Guerin, understood that. So, you know, Caldwell leaves, goes to the ABA, and, you know, the resentments just feed upon themselves. And Pete, as any rookie, no matter how talented, has problems adjusting. Just like when he was a freshman in college, he's having the same problems in practice as a rookie in the pros. All of his passes, they're bouncing off guys' chests, bouncing off guys' arms, guys' shoulders. No one's accustomed to seeing these passes. Except the difference is his daddy's not here to protect him anymore. He's by himself.
Pistol Pete's Basketball Diaries are brought to you by the official Pistol Pete website, Pistol Pete 23. Go to Pistol Pete 23 and learn more about the legend.
Want to learn more about Pistol Pete? Read Pistol, The Life of Pete Maravich by best-selling author Mark Kriegel, a book critics are calling mesmerizing, transcendent, and sensational. Pistol, The Life of Pete Maravich, wherever books are sold.